When I was dying in that hospital bed, my own parents looked at me and said, "She's not our daughter." After a horrific car accident left me fighting for my life, I expected my family to be by my side. Instead, they turned their backs when I needed them most, walking away like I was nothing. But what they didn't know was that their cruel abandonment would come back to haunt them in the most unexpected way. 1 week later, they returned, not for me, but for something they thought they deserved. The letter I left behind would make their faces turn pale and change everything forever. My name is Karen Miller, and for 34 years, I believed I was living the American dream. Every Sunday, our family gathered around my parents' mahogany dining table in their pristine suburban home. The walls were lined with family photos, Christmas mornings, graduation days, vacation smiles frozen in time. Mom would serve her famous pot roast while Dad carved the meat with surgical precision. My older brother Michael would crack jokes about his latest dating disasters, and my younger sister Sarah would update us on her teaching career. From the outside, we looked perfect. The Millers of Maple Street, respectable, successful, close-knit. Dad worked as a senior accountant at the biggest firm in town. Mom volunteered at the church and organized neighborhood bake sales. I had built a thriving marketing consultancy. Michael was climbing the corporate ladder at a tech company. And Sarah was everyone's favorite elementary school teacher. But if you listened carefully during those Sunday dinners, you'd notice something strange. When Dad talked about his retirement plans, his eyes would skip over me. When Mom discussed the family vacation house in Colorado, she'd mention the kids who would inherit it someday. But somehow, that never seemed to include me. When Sarah talked about family traditions she wanted to pass down to her future children, I was always referenced in past tense, as if I was already gone. "Karen always takes care of everything," Mom would say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "What would we do without our little problem solver?" The compliment felt hollow, like praise for a well-trained assistant rather than a beloved daughter. But I pushed those feelings down. Family was family, right? Blood was thicker than water. That's what I told myself every time I wrote another check to cover Dad's temporary financial shortfall, or when I spent my weekends helping Mom with projects that my siblings were mysteriously too busy to handle. The first real crack in my perfect family illusion came during a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. I had arrived early for Sunday dinner and let myself in through the back door, as I'd done countless times before. Voices were coming from the living room, Mom and Dad talking in hushed tones. "The insurance policies need to be updated," Dad was saying. "Michael and Sarah should be the primary beneficiaries." "What about Karen?" Mom's voice was barely audible. "She's not—" "It's complicated, Helen. We've discussed this. Blood family comes first." Blood family. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen in the kitchen, grocery bags still in my hands, trying to process what I'd just heard. What did he mean by blood family? I was their daughter. I had their last name. I had 34 years of memories with these people. When they noticed me standing there, Dad's face flushed red. "Karen, we didn't hear you come in." "I brought dessert," I managed to say, holding up the bags with shaking hands. "Oh, wonderful!" Mom's voice was too bright, too forced. "You know how much we love your apple pie." But the damage was done. The perfect Sunday dinner felt like a performance after that. Every laugh seemed forced. Every compliment felt calculated. When Michael made a joke about inheriting Dad's golf clubs, my parents exchanged a meaningful look. When Sarah mentioned wanting to keep Grandma's china in the family, no one met my eyes. I started paying attention to things I'd previously ignored. How my parents would stop talking when I entered a room, how family photos from recent years somehow featured fewer and fewer images of me, how conversations about family history always seemed to have gaps where my childhood should have been. "You're being too sensitive," Mom would say when I asked about it. "You know we love you just as much as the others." But love and belonging aren't the same thing. Love can be conditional. Belonging should be birthright. The gaslighting became more frequent. When I questioned why I wasn't included in family financial discussions, Dad would say, "We don't want to burden you with boring adult conversations." When I asked why my baby photos looked different from my siblings, Mom would claim I was imagining things and creating drama where none existed. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I really being overly sensitive? Was I paranoid? My anxiety spiked. I started having trouble sleeping, second-guessing every family interaction, analyzing every word for hidden meanings. The hot and cold treatment intensified. One day, Mom would call me her precious daughter and load me up with leftovers and praise. The next day, she'd make cutting remarks about how I never quite fit in with the family's way of doing things. Dad would boast about my business success to his friends, then turn around and make jokes about how I was too independent and didn't understand family loyalty. Meanwhile, my financial support to the family increased. Dad's temporary struggles became permanent. Mom's small favors became expensive obligations. I found myself paying for their home repairs, their medical bills, their vacation expenses. When I questioned the amounts, they'd remind me how much they'd sacrificed for me over the years. "We gave you everything," Dad would say during our private conversations about money. "A good home, education, opportunities. This is just you giving back." But Michael and Sarah weren't expected to give back in the same way. Their successes were celebrated without strings attached. Their money was their own. They were encouraged to buy houses, start families, build independent lives. I was expected to remain the eternal caretaker, the family ATM, the daughter who would always be available to solve everyone else's problems. The isolation was systematic and deliberate. A new family group chat was created that somehow never included me. Important family decisions were made without my input. Holiday plans were discussed and finalized before I was informed. I'd arrive at family gatherings to find that everyone already knew information I was hearing for the first time. "Oh, didn't we tell you?" became their favorite phrase. "We thought Michael had mentioned it." We assumed Sarah would have said something. I was becoming the family outsider while still being expected to fund their lifestyle. When I tried to address this with my siblings, they'd deflect. "You know how Mom and Dad are," Michael would say. "Don't take it personally." "They're just getting older and more set in their ways," Sarah would add. "Besides, you've always been the independent one." Independent, another way of saying alone. The physical and emotional toll was devastating. I started experiencing panic attacks during family gatherings. My successful business began to suffer as I struggled to concentrate. I'd find myself crying in grocery store parking lots after particularly brutal family dinners, wondering why I kept subjecting myself to the pain. But they were my family, the only family I'd ever known. The thought of walking away from them felt like emotional suicide. So I stayed, and I paid, and I absorbed their passive-aggressive attacks and backhanded compliments, telling myself that this was what family sacrifice looked like. The roles crystallized completely about 6 months before the accident. Dad sat me down for what he called a financial planning discussion. The conversation took place in his home office, the same room where he'd taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 12. "Karen, your mother and I have been thinking about the future," he began, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "We're not getting any younger, and we want to make sure everything is properly arranged." I nodded, expecting to finally be included in the family's long-term planning. "Michael will inherit the house and the vacation property," he continued matter-of-factly. "Sarah will get your mother's jewelry and the savings accounts. The life insurance policies have been updated accordingly." I sat in stunned silence, waiting for him to mention my portion. "Of course, we know we can count on you to continue helping with expenses until—" He paused delicately. "Until we're no longer here to need it." "What about me?" The words came out as a whisper. Dad's expression didn't change. "You've been so generous with your support over the years. We consider that your contribution to the family legacy. Michael and Sarah will need the inheritance to start their own families properly." Translation: I was the family bank, but not family enough to inherit from the account I'd been funding. That night, I went home to my empty apartment and stared at my bank statements. Thousands upon thousands of dollars had flowed from my accounts to theirs over the years, money that could have been my house down payment, my retirement fund, my security. Instead, it had subsidized their comfortable lifestyle while they planned a future that didn't include me. I called in sick to work the next day and spent hours researching family financial abuse. The articles I found described my situation with painful accuracy. The emotional manipulation, the financial exploitation, the systematic exclusion disguised as family duty. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overly sensitive. I was being used. But knowing the truth and acting on it are different things. I was trapped in a cycle of hope and disappointment that psychologists call trauma bonding. Every small kindness from my parents felt like proof that they really did love me. Every cruel dismissal felt like something I deserved for being ungrateful. The triangulation warfare intensified as my parents began playing my siblings and me against each other more openly. Michael would be praised for his loyalty to family when he agreed with their decisions. Sarah would be celebrated for her maturity when she supported their choices. I would be criticized for being difficult or ungrateful whenever I questioned anything. My health deteriorated under the constant stress. I developed chronic headaches, digestive issues, and insomnia. My doctor suggested therapy for anxiety, but I was too ashamed to admit that my own family was the source of my problems. How do you explain to a therapist that the people who raised you make you feel like a stranger in your own life? The final months before the accident were the darkest period of my adult life. I was financially depleted, emotionally exhausted, and spiritually broken. I'd lost myself completely in the role of family sacrifice, becoming a hollow shell of the confident woman I'd once been. The irony wasn't lost on me that my business, which focused on helping companies build authentic brand identities, was thriving while my personal identity had been systematically erased. I was excellent at helping others find their voice while mine had been silenced by years of manipulation and emotional abuse. I began having thoughts that scared me, not thoughts of hurting myself exactly, but thoughts of disappearing, of what it would be like if I just didn't exist anymore. If the burden of being the family disappointment could somehow end. These thoughts should have been a wake-up call, but I was too deep in the fog of dysfunction to recognize them as the crisis they were. On the morning of December 15th, I had what would be my final Sunday dinner with the Miller family. The conversation centered around Christmas plans that had been made without consulting me, at a time when I'd be out of town for a business conference. "We'll miss you, of course," Mom said with false sympathy. "But family traditions must go on." Michael and Sarah nodded in agreement, both of them having rearranged their schedules to accommodate the family celebration. Only I was expendable enough to miss. I drove home that night feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. 34 years old, successful by every external measure, but completely isolated from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I sat in my car in the apartment complex parking lot and called my best friend Jamie, who lived across the country. "I don't think I can do this anymore," I told her, tears streaming down my face. "Then don't," she said simply. "Karen, you don't owe them your life. You don't owe them your happiness. You don't owe them your money. But they're my family. Family doesn't treat you like this. Real family doesn't make you feel this way." After I hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time, thinking about Jamie's words. She was right, of course, but 34 years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. The little girl inside me still desperately wanted her parents' approval, still hoped that if she just tried hard enough, she could earn her place in the family she'd never quite belonged to. I went to bed that night, planning to have a serious conversation with my parents about boundaries and respect. I was going to demand to be treated as an equal family member or remove myself from their financial support system. I was going to find my voice and use it. I never got the chance. The next morning, December 16th, I was driving to an important client meeting when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of my car at 60 miles per hour. The impact sent my vehicle spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before it crashed into a concrete barrier. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of sirens and the taste of blood in my mouth. I remember thinking with crystal clarity that I was going to die. And in that moment of absolute terror, the only thought in my head wasn't about my business, or my achievements, or my apartment full of nice things. I thought about how I was going to die without ever knowing what it felt like to be truly loved by a family. When I woke up 3 days later in the intensive care unit, I couldn't move my legs. Machines surrounded my bed, beeping and humming with the rhythm of keeping me alive. Tubes and wires connected my body to technology that was breathing for me, monitoring my heart rate, feeding me nutrients. My head was wrapped in bandages, and every breath sent sharp pain through my ribs. A nurse named Patricia was adjusting one of my IV lines when I first opened my eyes. "Welcome back, sweetheart," she said with genuine warmth. "You gave us quite a scare." Through my drug-induced haze, I tried to speak but couldn't manage more than a croak. "Don't try to talk yet," Patricia said gently. "You have a breathing tube. Just rest. Your family has been notified." Family. The word sent a jolt through my system that was stronger than any of the medications flowing through my veins. My parents would be here. Maybe this crisis would finally show them how much I meant to them. Maybe near-death experiences put everything in perspective for everyone involved. I spent the next 2 days drifting in and out of consciousness, each time expecting to wake up to familiar faces filled with love and concern. Each time, I found only the kind, professional faces of the medical staff. On the 3rd day, when I was finally alert enough to stay awake for longer periods, I asked Patricia about my family. "They were here," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "They've been informed of your condition." Something in her voice made my stomach clench. "Are they coming back?" Patricia hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard the answer I was dreading. "I think it's best if you focus on your recovery right now," she said softly. But I couldn't focus on anything except the growing realization that my family wasn't coming. 3 days in intensive care, fighting for my life, and they hadn't stayed. They hadn't maintained a bedside vigil. They hadn't demonstrated the kind of desperate love that families show when they might lose someone forever. Dr. Rodriguez, my attending physician, confirmed what Patricia's expression had already told me. My parents had visited briefly on the 1st day, received the medical update, signed the necessary forms, and left. They hadn't returned. No one had called to check on my progress. "Is there someone else we should contact?" Dr. Rodriguez asked gently. "A close friend? Someone who should be here?" I gave him Jamie's number, knowing she was too far away to travel but needing someone in my corner. When she answered the phone and heard what had happened, she immediately booked a flight. "I'm coming," she said through tears. "I'll be there tomorrow morning. You don't have to—" "Karen, stop. You're my family. Real family shows up. Real family shows up." The words echoed in my head as I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and listening to the mechanical rhythm of the machines keeping me alive. Real family shows up. On the 5th day, my parents finally returned to the hospital. I heard their voices in the hallway before I saw them, talking to Dr. Rodriguez in hushed tones. Hope fluttered in my chest despite everything. Maybe they had been processing their emotions. Maybe they had needed time to accept how serious my condition was. Maybe they were here to finally show me the love I'd been craving my entire life. Mom entered the room first, her face carefully composed. Dad followed, wearing the same expression he used during difficult business meetings. They looked like they were visiting a distant acquaintance, not their daughter who had nearly died. "Karen," Mom said, her voice polite but distant. "You look better." I tried to smile, tried to bridge the awkward gap between us. "I'm glad you're here." Dad cleared his throat and got straight to business. "The doctors say you'll recover fully. That's good news." There was something wrong with this conversation, something fundamentally missing. They weren't asking how I felt. They weren't expressing relief that I'd survived. They weren't apologizing for not being here when I woke up. They were treating this like a medical consultation, not a family reunion. "I was scared," I whispered, hoping to break through their strange formality. "I thought I was going to die." Mom's face flickered with something that might have been emotion, but Dad's expression remained unchanged. "Yes, well, these things happen," he said matter-of-factly. "The important thing is that you're recovering." I stared at him in disbelief. "These things happen? I had nearly died in a car accident, and his response was that these things happen? That's when I noticed they were both looking around the room rather than at me. Their eyes were cataloging the flowers Jamie had sent, the cards from my business associates, the personal items the nurses had brought from my apartment. They were taking inventory. "Have you spoken to your insurance company yet?" Dad asked. "Insurance?" "About the settlement, from the drunk driver's insurance. These cases can be quite lucrative if handled properly." The words hit me like a physical blow. I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to walk, still processing the trauma of nearly dying, and my father was asking about money. "I haven't thought about that," I said quietly. "Well, you should," he continued. "We can recommend a good lawyer. These things need to be handled quickly." Mom nodded in agreement. "And of course, if there are any immediate expenses that your insurance doesn't cover, we're here to help." Help. They were offering to help with expenses when for years I had been covering their expenses. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. A nurse entered to check my vitals, and my parents stepped into the hallway. Through the thin hospital walls, I could hear their conversation. "The settlement could be substantial," Dad was saying. "6 figures, possibly 7, depending on the extent of her injuries." "That would solve a lot of problems," Mom replied. "The mortgage is due for renewal, and Michael needs help with his down payment." I closed my eyes, feeling something die inside me that had nothing to do with the car accident. They weren't here because they loved me. They weren't here because they were worried about me. They were here because they saw dollar signs. When they returned to the room, I pretended to be asleep. I listened as they had a whispered conversation with the nurse about my condition, my prognosis, my expected recovery timeline. Every question was clinical, practical. No one asked if I was in pain. No one asked if I was scared. No one asked how they could support me emotionally. After they left, I lay in the darkness and finally admitted the truth I'd been running from my entire life. These people didn't love me. They had never loved me. I was a resource to them, not a daughter. A source of income, not a family member. A convenient solution to their problems, not a person deserving of unconditional care. The next morning brought the final devastating blow. I woke up early, around 6 a.m., to the sound of familiar voices in the hallway. Mom and Dad were back, but they weren't alone. I could hear Michael and Sarah with them, along with another voice I didn't recognize. Curious despite my emotional exhaustion, I pressed the call button to summon a nurse. "Could you find out who my parents are talking to in the hallway?" I asked Patricia when she arrived. She looked uncomfortable. "Are you sure you want to know?" "Please." She left and returned a few minutes later with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of anger and protective concern that made me suddenly afraid of what she was going to tell me. "That's a lawyer," she said quietly. "They're discussing your case, your potential settlement." My settlement. Not their daughter's recovery, not my medical needs. My settlement. "There's something else," Patricia continued, her voice gentle but firm. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I've been a nurse for 20 years and I've never seen anything like this." "Like what?" "They haven't asked about you once. Not how you're feeling, not what you need, not when you can go home. Every conversation has been about money and legal proceedings." She paused, clearly struggling with whether to continue. "What is it?" I whispered. "When they thought I couldn't hear them yesterday, your father said something to your mother." She stopped, looking pained. "Please, I need to know." Patricia took my hand in hers. "He said, 'She's not really our daughter anyway. We've done enough for her over the years. This is just getting back what we're owed.'" The words hit me like the car accident all over again. Not really our daughter. After 34 years of wondering why I never quite fit, why I never felt fully accepted, why I was treated differently from my siblings, I finally had my answer. I wasn't their daughter. I wasn't their biological child. 34 years of my life had been built on a lie. The revelation hit me like a second car accident. 34 years of my life had been built on a lie, and suddenly, everything made sense. The subtle exclusions, the financial exploitation, the emotional distance, it all clicked into place with devastating clarity. I wasn't their daughter. I was their charity case turned ATM. But instead of destroying me, This truth became my salvation. Patricia squeezed my hand as I processed what she'd told me. I'm sorry, honey. I know this is a lot to take in. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing despite the pain medication. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something other than confusion and self-doubt. I felt anger, pure, righteous anger that burned through the fog of manipulation I'd been living in. Patricia, I said quietly, I need you to do something for me. Anything. When they come back, don't tell them I'm awake. I want to hear what they say when they think I can't hear them. Ha! She nodded, understanding immediately. 20 years of nursing had taught her to recognize family dysfunction when she saw it. An hour later, I heard their voices approaching again. I closed my eyes and controlled my breathing, pretending to sleep deeply. The lawyer was with them, a man with a voice like gravel who clearly specialized in personal injury cases. The settlement negotiations should begin within the month, he was explaining. Given the severity of the injuries and the clear liability, we're looking at a substantial payout. How substantial? Dad's voice was eager in a way I'd never heard when discussing my actual well-being. Conservative estimate? $400,000. If we can prove long-term disability, possibly more. My mother's sharp intake of breath was audible. That much? The drunk driver was clearly at fault, and he has excellent insurance. Your daughter's medical bills alone will exceed 6 figures. My daughter. Even the lawyer referred to me with more familial warmth than my own parents. Of course there will be legal fees, the lawyer continued, but the remainder should be quite sufficient for whatever family needs arise. Family needs. They were planning to take my settlement money before I'd even recovered from my injuries. The thing is, Dad said, his voice dropping to a whisper, Karen has always been very independent, stubborn even. She might not see the wisdom of keeping this money in the family. That's why we need to handle this carefully, Mom added. She's going to need a lot of support during her recovery, someone to manage her affairs. Support. They were planning to take control of my finances under the guise of helping me. I can draft power of attorney documents, the lawyer offered. If she's incapacitated or struggling with decision-making due to her head injury. She seems lucid now, Michael interjected. It was the first time he'd spoken, and he sounded uncomfortable. Head injuries can be tricky, the lawyer continued smoothly. Cognitive issues often don't manifest immediately. If the family is concerned about her judgment, I'd heard enough. These people, who had spent years treating me like an outsider while taking my money, were now planning to have me declared incompetent so they could control my accident settlement. After they left, I asked Patricia to contact the hospital's patient advocate and social worker. I also asked her to reach out to Jamie again. I need to make some changes, I told her. Starting now. The next few days were a whirlwind of quiet activity. While my family assumed I was too injured and medicated to think clearly, I was actually thinking more clearly than I had in years. The trauma had stripped away all the false hope and wishful thinking that had kept me trapped in their dysfunction. The hospital social worker, Maria Santos, turned out to be a godsend. She had extensive experience with family financial abuse and immediately understood my situation. This is more common than you'd think, she told me during our first private meeting. Adult children, especially adopted children, being exploited by their families. The fact that they're moving this quickly on your settlement is a major red flag. What can I do? First, we need to establish that you're competent to make your own decisions. Dr. Rodriguez can provide documentation of your cognitive function. Second, we need to secure your legal and financial independence before they can file any paperwork. Over the next week, while maintaining the appearance of being a passive patient, I was actually taking control of my life for the first time in years. Jamie flew in from Seattle and became my unofficial advocate, helping coordinate everything while my family remained blissfully unaware. The first step was getting access to my adoption records. Maria connected me with a legal aid attorney who specialized in adoption cases. The process was complicated by the fact that my parents had never told me I was adopted, but my attorney was able to work with the state's records office. What we discovered was shocking even to me. I hadn't just been adopted. I'd been adopted with a substantial trust fund. My biological parents had died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, leaving me with a significant inheritance that was supposed to be managed by my adoptive parents until I turned 25. At that point, it should have been transferred to me directly. I was 34 years old. That money had been mine for nearly a decade. Where is it now? I asked my attorney, though I already suspected the answer. That's what we need to find out. Your adoptive parents were the trustees, which means they had access to manage the funds. But there should have been oversight, regular reporting, specific restrictions on how the money could be used. We requested all the trust documents and financial records. What came back painted a picture of systematic theft that spanned over 15 years. My biological parents had left me nearly $500,000. Over the years, my adoptive parents had systematically drained the account, using the money for home improvements, vacations, and general living expenses. By the time I turned 25, there was barely $50,000 left. Instead of telling me about the trust and explaining what had happened to the money, they had simply transferred the remaining amount into an account they controlled and never mentioned it. For 9 years, they had let me struggle financially, asking me for loans and support while sitting on money that was legally mine. This is fraud, my attorney explained bluntly. Criminal fraud. They stole your inheritance and have been living off it for years. But the betrayal went even deeper. As we dug through the adoption records, we discovered that my biological parents hadn't just left money. They had left detailed instructions for my care. They had wanted me to know about my heritage, to understand where I came from, to have access to family photos and mementos they had set aside for me. None of that had ever been shared with me. My adoptive parents had erased my history as thoroughly as they had stolen my inheritance. The anger I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was clean and pure and energizing. For years, I had questioned myself, wondering if I was ungrateful or demanding too much. Now I knew the truth. I hadn't been demanding enough. While I was uncovering the extent of their fraud, my family was moving forward with their own plans. They had no idea I was conscious and competent enough to be making my own arrangements. They assumed I was a passive victim who would gratefully accept their help managing my affairs. Dr. Rodriguez provided extensive documentation of my cognitive abilities, confirming that despite my physical injuries, my mental faculties were completely intact. Maria helped me change my emergency contacts and medical decision-makers, removing my parents and designating Jamie instead. Most importantly, I worked with my attorney to prepare a comprehensive legal response to their attempted financial manipulation. We gathered evidence of the trust fund theft, documented years of financial abuse, and prepared to file both civil and criminal charges. But before taking legal action, I decided to give them one last chance to show their true colors. I asked Patricia to let my family know that I was ready for visitors and wanted to discuss my recovery plans with them. They arrived within hours, clearly excited to finally have the conversation they'd been planning. "Karen, sweetheart," Mom said, settling into the chair beside my bed with a forced smile. "We're so glad you're feeling better." "We've been thinking about your situation," Dad added, pulling out a folder of documents. "And we want to help." "Help how?" "Well, you're going to need a lot of support during your recovery. Physical therapy, ongoing medical care, help managing your business." Mom's voice was syrupy with false concern. "And then there's the legal settlement to consider," Dad continued. "These things can be very complicated. Lawyers and insurance companies can take advantage of people who aren't thinking clearly." I nodded encouragingly. "What do you suggest?" "We think it would be best if we helped manage things for a while," Mom said carefully. "Just until you're back on your feet." "Manage things how?" Dad opened his folder and pulled out several documents. "We've had some papers drawn up. Power of attorney, financial guardianship, that sort of thing. Just temporary, of course." I looked at the papers, recognizing the lawyer's letterhead from the conversation I'd overheard. They wanted me to sign away control of my finances, my settlement, my entire life. "This is very thoughtful," I said slowly. "But I'm curious about something." "What's that?" Mom asked, her smile faltering slightly. "I've been thinking about my childhood, trying to remember things, you know. Sometimes accidents can bring back old memories." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I was wondering, I continued, about my baby pictures. I don't remember seeing many of them, and I was curious about my birth certificate, my early medical records, things like that. The silence in the room was deafening. Why would you need those? Mom asked finally. Just curiosity. I nearly died, and it made me think about my history, where I came from. You understand? Another long pause. We can discuss that later, Dad said firmly. Right now, we need to focus on these financial arrangements. Actually, I said, my voice getting stronger, I think we should discuss it now. I reached under my pillow and pulled out a thick manila envelope, because I've already done some research. Dad's face went pale. What kind of research? The kind that tells me about my biological parents, about the trust fund they left me, about the $500,000 that was supposed to be mine when I turned 25. Mom made a small, choked sound. The kind of research that shows me exactly where that money went over the years, the home improvements, the vacations, the comfortable lifestyle you've been living off my inheritance. I sat up straighter in bed, ignoring the pain in my ribs. The kind of research that proves you've been stealing from me for over 15 years. Dad tried to maintain his composure. Now, Karen, I think you're confused. My injuries have nothing to do with my ability to read bank records, I interrupted, or legal documents, or adoption files. I pulled papers from the envelope and held them up. This is documentation of every fraudulent withdrawal from my trust fund. This is proof that you drained my inheritance and then let me struggle financially while asking me for loans. Mom started crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of panic. You don't understand, she said desperately. We raised you. We gave you everything. That money was compensation for all we spent on you over the years. Compensation? I stared at her in disbelief. You think raising an adopted child entitles you to steal their inheritance? We gave you a good life, Dad said, his voice rising. A better life than you would have had otherwise. A life built on lies. A life where you treated me like an outsider while living off money that belonged to me. The mask was completely off now. The pretense of parental love had evaporated, replaced by naked greed and entitlement. So what? Dad said angrily. What are you going to do about it? I smiled for the first time since the accident. I'm going to take back what's mine, all of it. I pressed the call button and Patricia appeared within seconds. She had been waiting in the hallway as planned. Patricia, could you please escort my visitors out? They won't be returning. Now, wait just a minute, Dad started, but I cut him off. No, I'm done waiting. I'm done being your victim. I'm done pretending we're a family when you've never treated me like anything more than a resource to exploit. You can't do this, Mom sobbed. We're your parents. No, I said firmly. You're thieves who stole my inheritance and my identity. But that ends today. As security escorted them from the room, Dad turned back one last time. You'll regret this, Karen. Family is everything, and you're destroying yours. I'm not destroying my family, I replied calmly. I'm freeing myself from people who were never my family to begin with. After they left, I sat in the silence of my hospital room and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. For the first time in my adult life, I had stood up for myself. I had refused to be manipulated. I had chosen my own well-being over their comfort. It felt like being reborn. The next week was a blur of legal activity. My attorney filed both civil and criminal charges against my adoptive parents. The civil suit sought recovery of my stolen inheritance plus damages. The criminal charges included fraud, theft, and financial abuse of a vulnerable adult. The local district attorney was very interested in the case. Apparently, financial abuse of adopted children by their adoptive parents was an emerging pattern they'd been tracking. Cases like yours help us build precedent, the prosecutor explained. Your willingness to press charges could help other victims find the courage to come forward. Within days, my adoptive parents' assets were frozen pending investigation. Their comfortable lifestyle, built on my stolen inheritance, came to an abrupt halt. The house I had helped them maintain was now subject to a lien. The cars I had helped them purchase were repossessed when they couldn't make payments without access to their accounts. Michael and Sarah, who had been counting on their inheritance, discovered that there was nothing left to inherit. Everything their parents owned had been purchased with stolen money. The family group chat that had excluded me for so long suddenly went silent. No more discussions of family vacations or holiday plans. No more casual conversations about the future. The Miller family was imploding, and I was no longer there to serve as their financial foundation. But the most satisfying part wasn't their downfall, it was my own reconstruction. With Jamie's help, I began building a new life from my hospital bed. I contacted my business clients and made arrangements for my recovery period. I researched the best physical therapy programs for my injuries. I started planning for the future I wanted, not the future others expected of me. Most importantly, I began learning about my biological family for the first time. My parents had left letters for me, photos, family history, even videos they had recorded before their death. For 34 years, I had wondered about my identity. Now, I finally had answers. My biological father had been a teacher, my mother a nurse. They had met in college and spent their short marriage traveling and documenting their adventures. The videos they left showed two people deeply in love, already excited about raising me, planning for my future with the kind of genuine care I had never experienced with my adoptive family. "We hope you grow up knowing how much you were wanted," my biological mother said in one video, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. "We hope you know that every choice we've made has been about giving you the best possible life." They had died when I was too young to remember them, but they had loved me in a way my adoptive parents never had. Real love. Unconditional love. The kind of love that leaves detailed instructions for your care and sets aside money for your future because your happiness matters more than anything else. 3 weeks after the confrontation in my hospital room, I was finally ready to be discharged. My legs were working again, though I still needed physical therapy. My ribs were healing, and my head injury had left no lasting cognitive effects. Jamie had arranged for me to stay in a short-term rental near the hospital while I completed my recovery. As she helped me pack my belongings, I found myself looking forward to the future for the first time in years. "Are you scared?" she asked as we waited for the discharge paperwork. "No," I said, and I meant it. For the first time in my life, I'm not scared. I'm free. We were interrupted by a knock on the door. A young man in a delivery uniform entered with a large envelope. "Karen Miller?" "That's me." "This is for you." I opened the envelope and found a thick stack of legal documents. The cover letter was from my attorney, but the contents were from my adoptive parents' lawyer. They were trying to settle out of court. The offer was substantial, full restitution of my stolen inheritance, plus additional compensation. In exchange, I would agree to drop all charges and sign a non-disclosure agreement. "They're scared," I realized out loud. "Good," Jamie said firmly. "They should be." But as I read through the settlement offer, I realized something important. I didn't want their money anymore. I didn't want anything from them. What I wanted was justice, and justice meant holding them accountable for what they had done. I picked up the phone and called my attorney. "I'm rejecting the settlement offer," I told him. "Are you sure? It's a generous offer." "I'm sure. This isn't about money anymore. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else." "That means a trial. It means your story becoming public record." "Good. Maybe it will help other people recognize the signs of family financial abuse. Maybe it will give someone else the courage to fight back." After I hung up, Jamie looked at me with pride. "You're not the same person who was in this bed 3 weeks ago." She was right. The car accident had broken my body, but it had also broken the spell that had kept me trapped in a toxic family dynamic for 34 years. I had finally found my voice, and I was going to use it. A week later, I checked out of the hospital and moved into my temporary apartment. It was small and furnished with basics, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in years. It was mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could make me feel unwelcome in my own space. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to my adoptive family. I was done communicating with them. This letter was for everyone else. For the extended family members who had watched me be excluded and said nothing. For the family friends who had witnessed my mistreatment and remained silent. For anyone who might be wondering why I had destroyed my family. I told them everything. The financial abuse, the emotional manipulation, the stolen inheritance, the lies about my adoption. I explained that I hadn't destroyed a family. I had exposed the truth about people who were never my family to begin with. I sent copies to everyone in my adoptive parents' social circle. I wanted them to know exactly who they had been supporting all these years. The responses came quickly. Some people expressed shock and offered support. Others accused me of being vindictive and ungrateful. But the most meaningful responses came from people who shared their own stories of family financial abuse. "Thank you for speaking out," one woman wrote. "My sister has been doing something similar to our elderly father, and I didn't know how to address it. Your courage gives me hope." "I went through something similar with my adoptive family," another person shared. "I never pressed charges, and I've always regretted it. You're doing the right thing." These responses reminded me why I had rejected the settlement offer. This wasn't just about my situation. It was about breaking the silence around family financial abuse and showing other victims that they didn't have to accept mistreatment just because it came from relatives. The trial was set for 6 months later. In the meantime, I focused on rebuilding my life and my business. Physical therapy helped me regain full mobility. Therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma helped me process 34 years of manipulation and abuse. Most importantly, I began building a chosen family. Jamie moved closer to help with my recovery. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during the years I was consumed with trying to earn my adoptive family's approval. I met other survivors of family abuse through support groups and online communities. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who accepted me unconditionally, people who celebrated my successes without expecting anything in return, people who offered support without keeping score. Real family, the kind my biological parents had dreamed of for me. 6 months after leaving the hospital, I received another envelope from my lawyer. This one contained the final settlement from the drunk driver's insurance company. The amount was exactly what their lawyer had predicted, $450,000. But unlike my adoptive family's plans for this money, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I used part of the settlement to purchase a small house, the first home I had ever owned that truly belonged to me. I invested another portion for my retirement, something I had never been able to do while supporting my adoptive family's lifestyle. But the most meaningful use of the money was the foundation I established to help other adopted children and family abuse victims. The Karen Miller Foundation for Family Justice provided legal assistance, counseling resources, and financial support for people trying to escape abusive family situations. "My biological parents wanted me to have a good life," I explained at the foundation's launch event. "The best way I can honor their memory is by helping other people achieve the same freedom and happiness they wanted for me." Standing at that podium, surrounded by genuine supporters and fellow survivors, I finally understood what family was supposed to feel like. It wasn't about blood relations or legal obligations. It was about people who chose to love and support each other without conditions. It was about showing up when someone needs you. It was about truth, trust, and genuine care. It was about everything my adoptive family had never given me and everything my chosen family provided in abundance. The trial began on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 10 months after my car accident. My adoptive parents had aged dramatically over the past year. The stress of the investigation, the frozen assets, and the public exposure had taken its toll. They still refused to admit wrongdoing, claiming they had managed my inheritance responsibly and that I was being vindictive and ungrateful. Their lawyer painted me as a troubled adoptee who was lashing out at the people who had sacrificed everything to raise me. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, trust documents, witness testimony from financial advisors who had questioned the unusual withdrawals over the years. The prosecutor painted a clear picture of systematic theft spanning more than a decade. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. As the judge read the sentence, 5 years in prison for Dad, 3 years for Mom, plus full restitution and penalties, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. It was about justice for the little girl who had been lied to and exploited for 34 years. After the trial, I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine. Jamie was waiting for me on the steps, along with several friends from my support group and a reporter from the local newspaper who had been covering the case. "How do you feel?" the reporter asked. I thought about the question for a moment, considering everything that had brought me to this point, the years of confusion and self-doubt, the car accident that had nearly killed me, the painful discovery of the truth about my adoption and the theft of my inheritance, the difficult process of rebuilding my life and finding my voice. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." And I was. Free from the burden of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. Free from the financial exploitation that had defined my adult life. Free from the lies and manipulation that had shaped my identity for 34 years. Most importantly, I was free to build the life my biological parents had dreamed of for me, a life filled with authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't come with a price tag. Standing on those courthouse steps, surrounded by my chosen family and bathed in afternoon sunlight, I finally understood what my biological mother had meant in that video she left for me. I was wanted, I was loved, and I was finally, truly free.